In this lecture, we're going to dive into our second engagement scenario. We've got an operator that's going to go gain physical access to an internal network, and we suspect that there's a chance this network might have restrictive internet access. So it'll be difficult for us to call home from our devices. But that said, it seems like once we've compromised an internal system, it should still be able to call back to our C2. Now, how can we get a device on their network that we can use to perform operations? Well, you might be thinking, just have a laptop with another network interface and like a hotspot or something. And if you did think that, you'd basically be correct. However, remember, this is an operation, and our operators aren't necessarily going to remain in the building overnight, and they may have other physical objectives they need to achieve outside of the internal network compromise. So, a better solution is a Dropbox. If you remember at the start of this course, we kind of built our own reverse VPN tunnel Dropbox VM, so to speak. It was VM, but that's kind of what we built. And now we're going to apply that same tool and those same skills to use on this engagement. Now, normally, a Dropbox consists of a portable computer system of some sort, usually a small one like a cell phone or a Raspberry Pi that can be used to perform offensive network activities. In our case, we're using a VM, but normally you could tether something like the Raspberry Pi or a Rock64 board to a wireless interface or some kind of cellular connection. So basically you'd have a small tiny computer strapped to a cell phone or something like that. And then you'd plug that into the network jack at the physical location in the office, hopefully on the network that you're trying to access. And from there, you kind of try to hide your device in a wall or something like that, maybe on the server rack if that's where you are. It just kind of depends where your network entry point is, but that's the general concept, right? And from there, that should give us access to the internal network and give our device internet via that cellular connection. From there, it's just a matter of being able to remotely access the device. That's where the reverse VPN tunneling concept comes in. Obviously, in our example, we're using a VM instead of a physical box, but the same principles still apply. So again, the idea is that our device will connect to the VPN server that we control, and from there we can just actually SSH right into it and start attacking the network remotely, just like we did in our example from earlier. So let's get all that set up. As you see here, I've modified the Vagrant config with this one line to add a public network interface. By default, the NAT interface works perfectly fine for basic internet access and using the VM, but we want to add this interface because this is going to help us simulate me plugging into a physical network. In fact, I actually have a physical wire going into my laptop that I'm mapping this to that is plugged into my target's environment. So it is pretty accurately simulating what we would do with a Dropbox. The NAT connection is going to simulate kind of our cell phone Wi-Fi tethering, and the public network is the actual line into the network jack. So I'm going to simulate our operator actually playing the box. So we're going to power it on. In our case, we do that by issuing the vagrant up command. And here you'll actually get to see the network interface, me selecting EN4. That's the 3.0 gigabit Ethernet. That's me actually wired into a network jack. So that's going to power on, and while that powers on, I want to talk over the scenario a little bit more. So one of the things I want to point out is that if we were to use wireless as stated in my example, that implies the use of a hotspot. And hotspots are going to be emitting a wireless signal, right? This actually adds risk to the operation whether you realize it or not, but it's a trade-off. There's not a wrong way to do it, but you just need to think about what the risks are that you want to manage and what features that you need for your operation. So having the hotspot emit an access point gives our operators the means to access the internet on like their own systems, phones, laptops, if they need it. They can share that with the Dropbox while they're on site if they need to. And it also gives us a means, from a reasonable distance, to access the Dropbox if we're nearby. Say we totally lose access or our C2s are blocked on their network, we still have it physically on location and can drive up to the building, connect to it, and still be able to, conduct some operational activities. The trade-off here where the risk comes in is that a blue teamer could more easily locate the wireless device, and they could do this by scanning for access points in the area and walking around monitoring signal strength, and they could at least get a rough idea of where we are and start looking around. The alternative here is to have a wired interface tethered to our Dropbox. This will keep the network isolated, but we'd lose all the benefits that we'd have if it was wireless. So it's simply a trade-off that your team has to decide to measure the risk on and consider which configuration falls in line with the TTPs that you want to emulate. Now, neither of these really apply to this VM because there's no actual cellular signal. Our NAT is emulating that and it's all closed circuit. So I guess in a way we're simulating the tethered wired connection scenario with the cellular connection. But regardless, that's an important tactical note to have. All right, so back to the Dropbox. It is definitely powered on now, and it should automatically be connected to all the proper networks as well. So we'll Vagrant SSH into the system. Now, normally, you'd want to configure your VPN script to auto-connect. You know, you could do this either via like a systemctl service or cron drop, whatever have you, but just some kind of basic bash script that's going to automatically connect your device to the VPN once it's fully booted up. That way, your operator can just literally plug in the device, connect it to the network, and then move on to their next objective. However, for demo purposes, I've not configured it that way because I want to walk through the steps manually, see the connections go through, so that way we can map this all out. But you could literally automate this with a bash script and some services. So we're SSHing now, and we want to connect to our VPN. So we should be able to do that with this command right here. Open VPN, specify that Dropbox config from earlier, and the ampersand will background this so we can still do some operations on this box while we're here if we need to throughout the demo. But hopefully we won't, because this should connect right away and be good to go. Now you might be thinking, but we never configured the VPN server. Well, remember, we did configure a VPN server in the reverse VPN tunneling session. And I'm actually just using that server all over again. It's a completely separate server from our C2 server. So you feel free to do the same thing. Reuse that code or even completely reuse that setup from before if you still have it around. If you don't and you don't have the code and you need to rebuild it, of course the references for all this are all within the course material. You'll be able to easily access this code and rebuild it. It's simply the base VPN Terraform and then follow the steps to set up PyVPN. So now with that said, we do have our VPN server up and we can just shift back over here and use PyVPN to check and see what clients are connected. Looks like our Dropbox is successfully connected. So now we can just SSH into it and start hacking. So we'll do just that. Awesome. So we're in and we're ready to go. Now, this system is pre-configured with a few other tools. We're going to be targeting a Windows system that we've identified during some external reconnaissance. And I'm actually going to skip the recon here. This is just kind of for the scenario and the storytelling. So for the sake of time, we are going to be pretending that we did some passive recon, something with NetDiscover and Wireshark, maybe identified a few potential Windows systems with SMB, and now I've got one here that I want to target. Now we've got some pretty good intel based on some external discoveries that this network may have poor password policies, and we have a pretty good idea what the user's password might be for the target that we're going after. Our intel tells us that often users' default passwords when they're set up by the admin are the user's name followed by 2 hash or pound symbols. The user that we're going after we think has the name of P. Diddy, and that's just based on some NetBIOS information, but we didn't find any record of that specific user in our recon, and we've pretty much got a list of all the users now. So we're thinking this may be the domain admin, like the default administrator account. If that's the case, we're going to try administrator as the user, but still keep the P. Diddy prefix of the password to see if it's still the default based on the information we know. So we're going to try that and see if this user has a weak password or not. Now, we could use Metasploit to try and brute force some passwords and even use its psexec module, but I want something a little different for this exercise, something a little less noisy. And so for that, I've chosen Python Impacket. Now, Impacket isn't perfectly stealthy. It leaves behind artifacts like many other tools, but it is a little bit closer to living off the land than some of the other tools that we could use. And it has a nice psexec example that we can take advantage of. With any tools, if you need more stealth or need to tune things, that's perfectly acceptable, and it's all about the TTPs you're trying to emulate. Impacket does generate some artifacts by writing to shares, generates some network writing artifacts. Even though it cleans up after itself, it's going to leave a little bit of a trail. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Lots of tools leave lots of artifacts. It's all about documenting and understanding what those are and measuring the impact that that risk has on your operation before you pick a certain tool. Impacket in this case is going to serve us just fine for what we need. So I'm going to cd into the examples directory, and then we'll use python psexec.py. And remember, the user we want to target is administrator. We're hoping this is the default like domain administrator, and they just didn't properly configure it, and we should be able to get in with that default that they set. And the domain controller we've identified is at 2.100. So we're going to do that, and then we're going to specify that we want to run the cmd.exe command. Should prompt us for the password, and we believe that password is the letter P, followed by the name Diddy, and 2 pound signs. See if it works. All right, look at that. We got a system shell into the authority system. Now, normally you don't want to run who am I right away when you get on a system. I'm just doing that because we're in a lab environment and I want to know what level of access I have. But if you log in to a system and immediately run who am I, That's something easy for blue teams to write alerts and trigger on. Nobody does that except for an attacker, because an attacker doesn't know who they are. Think about it. If I'm a system administrator, if I am the legitimate domain admin and I log into a system, I know I'm domain admin. I'm not going to check my permissions. I probably wouldn't check my permissions unless something is giving me a permission error that I'm working on, and there'd be a clear trace of that. So if there's a login event immediately followed by like an ID or who am I, that's a pretty good trigger. And if you're a defender out there watching this course and you don't have that rule in your environment, here's your tip. Put that rule in. It's a really good trigger to catch people who aren't paying attention to their OPSEC. So we have a shell now. You know what that means? It means we've completed phase 1. We got in. Now we need to stay in. So that's going to conclude this lecture, and in the next one we will begin executing phase 2.